4 years ago, ooh, that's loud, in mid-May, my partner Jeanette and I and our adult children left on a plane bound for Spain. We spent 10 days together, and then Jeanette and I began our 3-month sabbatical by walking across the Camino de Compostela de Santiago from the French side of the Pyrenees all the way to Santiago in the western part of Spain, covering about 550 miles. Most people think of sabbaticals as a time for rest. When other people tell me what they did on their sabbaticals, I am always so surprised at how much time they spent on a beach or secluded in a cabin or even at home. We spent 31 days walking the Camino with 3 rest days, then went to Greece and toured, but also had a fairly steady hiking regime, because then we went to Japan and after acclimating, got to hike the ancient pilgrimage path called the Kumano-Kodo. From there, we toured the island of Shikoku, which led us to being able to bike across the 7 islands of the Seto Inland Sea. We spent a couple of days with a new friend we met on the Camino and then headed home and right back to work. Most people I know, including some of you who are sitting here in this very sanctuary, thought that maybe we had planned too much activity for a time that was supposed to be restful and restorative. Jeanette and I have talked a lot about it since then, and we've both decided we wouldn't change a thing, and that we were restored in various ways. While I was at what is called the Next Conference in North Carolina a few weeks ago, I had a realization. It's possible I am not very good at resting. After listening to Dr. Keisha Walker-Barnes, who is a professor of counseling and pastoral care at Columbia Theological Seminary, teach us about rest over the course of the week, I am a new convert to the concept of rest, and I'm leaving behind my old life of being resistant to rest. My new commitment that I am speaking aloud this morning is to rest as resistance. So to give you some context for this conference that I was at, I was there because I'm part of a coaching cohort being trained in coaching skills while simultaneously learning how to coach with anti-racist practices and with an anti-racist lens. If that sounds tricky, I can attest to you the reality has been very tricky. Our coaching cohort is multicultural, and we have had some very difficult conversations along the way because of some of the interactions with white folks in our group. We were all required to attend the conference in North Carolina so that we could practice group coaching. The theme of the conference itself was rest, restore, renew. Who doesn't want to do those things? Interestingly, the conference had lower attendance than usual. The conference planners decided to do something completely new this year. So instead of offering workshops, they decided to break everyone up into group coaching cohorts so that instead of just receiving all this information, there would be an opportunity to actually integrate and process the content through the week. The idea was that if that would be allowed, then maybe people would actually be able to take practical and real things with them when they left, instead of what usually happens at conferences, which is you fill your notebooks and you go home and the notebooks sit on the shelf. So once a day we met in our coaching groups for group coaching during this week. And people came from all over the country to attend. While the majority of people were white and pastors, there were some people of color and there were some elders, but not many of each of those groups. The hope for the conference was that we could create a brave space where we could together explore rest in the context of racism and anti-racism, and then have courageous conversations. The reality was pretty messy. Most of the white pastors there were exhausted and ready to throw in the towel with ministry, and expressed great frustration with life in general and how hard life has been. On the surface, after a 2-year pandemic, that makes some sense. But in the context we were in, with pastors who are also Black and Latino and Asian American and Pacific Islanders and Indigenous, it was problematic because exhaustion and the need for rest is often used by white folks as a way to opt out of justice work. Are you getting the sense of how tricky it can be to have these kinds of conversations all together? When Dr. Walker Barnes began teaching on the first full day about rest as resistance, I knew I had some things to learn. But I almost laughed out loud when she said, "There is some resistance to rest." Of course, my initial thought was about all the people I know who are resistant to rest. Isn't that how most of us hear sermons? We hear something and we think, oh, so-and-so really ought to hear this. Or this is the perfect message for this person. And then eventually we realize, oh, maybe this message is for us in some way. As she began going deeper into her message, I got it. I was supposed to be listening and learning. Toward the beginning, she pointed out how rest and sleep are woven into various parts of Scripture, and usually we skip right over those parts. Our text in Genesis that Jasper read this morning is one example of that. How many of us have heard this account of creation over and over again, and yet have we really ever thought very much or deeply about the fact that God rested from labor, the labor of creation? God actually paused and then rested. God, who is beyond time or space, rested. God, who is not in bodily form doing the work of creation, rested. And it wasn't just a coffee break. It was an entire amount of time, similar to the amount of time it took for various parts of creation. Dr. Walker Barnes pointed out 2 important aspects of this particular creation story. One is the fact that humans, all humanity was made in God's image. So no matter how hard we work or how many ladders we climb or what our numbers look like or how long our CVs might be or the kind of education we have or how many days off we forego in order to be productive, no matter all of that, we are never going to be more than we are in the moment of creation. The second important aspect is that God modeled for us that labor is best when it is interrupted by rest. So we're created in God's image, which means we have enough and we are enough, no matter what. And labor is best when interrupted by rest. Putting rest in the context of resistance means that it does relate to justice and activism and organizing and how we do all of that without burning ourselves completely out. Our culture here in the U.S. does not do rest. We are proud of saying things like, "I'll rest when I'm dead." You've heard that before, I'm sure. Or mind over matter. Anyone who's ever been an athlete has heard that. And we're also familiar with the saying that says, "An object at rest stays at rest." The point being, don't rest. Many of us value, whether we acknowledge it or not, staying in motion. Productivity is synonymous with worth. Dr. Walker Barnes pointed out, because this is her context, that higher education and seminaries want us to believe that we are worth as much as our CVs are long. We're expected to keep up and produce in academies. And then when we get out of the academies, if we're going into churches, churches then reinforce this with all the focus on numbers related to membership and budgets. And rest is really about ceasing from labor, sometimes even ceasing from motion and from various kinds of activity. Rest can also be about quieting and centering our minds and our bodies. Dr. Walker Barnes pointed out that Black women have been conditioned from the very beginning to care for everyone else at the expense of themselves, and in fact, their very lives in many cases. The reason rest becomes resistance is that it's a way of offering defiance to a death-dealing culture. Death stalks Black people in the U.S., and it's not all economic. We know that Black people have been forced to live in areas with the highest concentrations of pollution and then given very little access to health care. While rest is not a cure for the hatred that causes Black death, or even for the health disparities that cause Black death, it can mitigate the impacts of living in a world that does not mean for Black people to survive. Dr. Walker Barnes pointed out that one of the problems of founding a country on slavery is that the logic of slavery continues, which means Black bodies are seen as commodities and worth the work they can produce. And that logic has certainly continued. And it isn't just Black bodies anymore that are commodified. Her point is, rest can actually help heal the body. The time when we're sleeping is when our brains flush themselves of toxins. If we don't get enough sleep, the toxins are stored in our bodies. Rest is also resistance, though, because it is a way of stewarding our creative potential. This part of her teaching really impacted me. She talked about how most of the pastors and students she knows have been in crisis for at least the past 10 years. The whole church has been in crisis because The baby boomer generation did not retire when they were supposed to after investments tanked in 2008. So there are too many older pastors still working, not enough churches open for graduates to come in and be hired. But also, she traced the timeline back to 2013 when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. And then Trump was elected in 2016. For the past 2 years, we've had COVID and the murder of George Floyd and so many other police shootings of Black people and brown people. And our systems have been in flight or fight mode. We have been reacting and reacting and reacting. And when we are in emergency or react mode, we're doing what we are doing on someone else's terms and not on our own terms. And usually the someone else is about the powers and principalities. And so she says, if we're going to engage the powers and principalities with creativity, not just reaction, there's a huge difference. If we're going to engage with creativity, we must find ways to rest. Well, as you might imagine, the topic of rest brings up the whole issue of self-care, because self-care is a term that is used for all kinds of things. Dr. Walker Barnes was clear about the commodification of self-care. Self-care has become synonymous with consumerism. In the US, self-care is being sold. It's synonymous with buying something for ourselves, or with traveling, or with consuming. During the pandemic, the Barna Group did a poll. They're a religious researcher group. And they discovered that 42% of pastors said that on a regular basis they think about leaving ministry for good. That is an issue of burnout. But buying something or consuming something or going away for a week is not going to change that. She talked about how the conversation about self-care is tricky in multicultural spaces, again, because of how many white folks use the need for self-care as a way to opt out of justice work. Historically, people of color have not had an option to walk away because working for justice is a daily activity because of what they experience every single day. Self-care for Dr. Walker Barnes is about gratitude, stewardship, wellness, a holistic approach, and then reparative and what she calls holy living. And the underlying principle for her in all of this is what comes up in our Genesis text about how we are all made in the image of God. Every single one of us has been created in God's image, which means no one of us is more important than another. We are called to tend the image of God in us, which means stewarding ourselves, being stewards of ourselves through self-care. And according to Walker Barnes, that means prioritizing our mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and relational health. If we can do this, we're better able to participate in God's mission in ways that are both sustainable and courageous. Sometimes it is literally about doing the simple things like drinking water eating the food that works for our bodies, getting the sleep we need. It also means things that sound simple, like being in relationships that are mutually beneficial and loving. How many relationships are you in where you are the one who does more caregiving or giving in general? How many relationships are you in where your output and your input are balanced? How are you doing at tending the relationships that matter most to you? And what about relationship with God? What practices are we doing on a regular basis to continue to develop and sustain our relationship with God? If you're anything like me, you hear these things and you think, oh my word, more things to add to my to-do list. It might seem like self-care simply means adding more things to your days and your nights. But here's another way to think about it. Studies have been done over time about the impacts of trauma on the body and how trauma can become encoded in DNA. One of the more famous studies was done on Holocaust survivors, and that study demonstrated that genetic changes that occur due to trauma can be passed on through DNA for at least 2 generations, if not more. If you think about the trauma related to chattel slavery and even sharecropping, and even redlining and contract buying right here in Chicago, where generations of people lost everything, it gives a whole new meaning to the need for self-care and wellness and repair. And trauma comes in many forms. You may have been the genetic recipient of trauma from past generations in your families. And that impacts wellness. Our justice team, I mentioned this earlier, our justice team is leading an effort here in Chicago related to reparations because of the need for repair. As the same book title states, our bodies keep score of trauma, and trauma through generations. So when we talk about self-care and we talk about wellness, what we're talking about in part is giving our bodies new stories. We tend to our physical, spiritual, and emotional wellness because we recognize that we're made in the image of God and our bodies are part of the body of Christ. Prioritizing wellness is subversive, and practicing rest is a form of resistance. Now, before you decide to take a year off of church as your form of rest, or to resign from your ministry team to practice more self-care, let's just pause for a minute. I did not walk away from this conference thinking about leaving ministry altogether. In fact, I felt my call strengthened. As a person of white, as our trainers like to say, I am called to do the work of justice and repair. The work is exhausting in part because of how hard we are struggling here in the U.S. to even tell the truth about the harms done. knowing that the work is a marathon and not a sprint. I have to prioritize my rest and well-being in such a way that I can run this marathon for as long as is necessary. My new realization, which is where my new commitment from rest comes from, my new realization is that I can find ways each day to prioritize rest and to work on my well-being. I don't have to wait for some big chunk of time. I don't have to wait for vacation or medical leave or some kind of big emergency, or even for my day off to make sure these things happen. Now, I am creating new habits, so it is going to take some time. But one of the things I have realized is I need to interrupt my workday because of the stress that I feel when I'm engaged with work. It's work I love, and it's still stressful work. So how can I interrupt instead of getting on that moving walkway and going faster and faster and faster through the day as I know the day is coming to a close? All I have to do is get off for a minute, or 10 minutes, or 15 minutes. So how can we begin to create new practices? I want to create daily practices of rest and well-being that are sustainable and that will give my body new stories and will allow me to be a fierce advocate for justice for the rest of my life. That's at the personal level. We also have work to do communally. How do we, as a community, incorporate rest into what we are doing so that it's not the case that our only option is to opt out for a while? How do we incorporate well-being into what we do? And how does what we do personally impact what we are doing communally? I have seen firsthand the impact on this community when I don't prioritize on a daily basis rest and well-being. So how can we ensure that our work is sustainable and that we are not burning out the people most involved? Our session will be having some conversation about this, and I hope that we will all be having conversations about this so that all of us can participate in the subversive work of wellness. Amen.